Welcome, everybody. My name is Gideon Rose. I'm an adjunct senior fellow here at the Council, and welcome to the third session of our Hauser Symposium. On this one will be on the Trump era and the future of the U.S.-led order. We've heard a lot of really first-rate historians and policy analysts, and we've talked a lot about contingency and about the choices that were made and couldn't be made and some of the things that might have been done differently. And I think all that is true, and all of this has been a really interesting discussion, but there's also a structural context in which all these policy choices that we've been talking about have been made. And I think it's actually useful to step back, especially as for this final panel, to look at the larger structural context, because we may be at one of those hinge points in history in which we're not just making choices about an individual issue or an individual situation or with individual policymakers, but we may be confronting one of these large structural changes in international relations in a new era, which will guide all the choices that people make. So what do I mean by that? Modern international relations, I would argue, this is the way I teach it, has had three periods, fundamentally different periods so far, and we may be entering a fourth. From the mid-17th century to the mid-20th century, 3 full centuries, Europe's order, it was defined by the end of the 30 Years' War, which ends up giving European states dominance in the international system, and you end up having 300 years in which you have multipolar state conflict as the normal state of affairs in the system. You fight each other in Europe, you colonize outside, you end up getting a sort of balance of power and imperialism, and the world is run this way for several hundred years. That goes down in a blaze of self-immolation in a second 30 Years' War from 1914 to 1945, in which European civilization and European great powers blow themselves up. And the multipolar modern international system shifts into a post-war bipolar system in which two new offshoots or two new powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, essentially divide the major areas of the world between them with their alliance systems and structures. And there's a third area that is the developing world, the post-colonial world. We now call it the global south, but somewhat outside. And you have the second era, which was our first panel, essentially the Cold War era, a bipolar system in which the Soviet Union acts like all other predatory powers have always acted, creating a system in its own sphere. And the United States chooses to do something different. After 1945, with the advent of nuclear weapons, you also have the advent of the liberal international order, or some version of it, in which the United States chooses to play international politics as a team sport rather than an individual sport. And so you get in the American side of the Cold War alliance system a much different kind of pattern of international relations than you've ever had in history before. We rebuild our allies via things like the Marshall Plan. We protect them with things like NATO. And we play as a team in our area. Then in 1989, with the end of the Cold War, in 1991 with the end of the Soviet Union, you segue into the post-Cold War era, which is also the unipolar era, in which that American system now spreads to the world at large. And you take the institutions that you built in the American sphere, and you essentially say, now there's no barrier to spreading them globally. And so you had multipolarity for 300 years. You have bipolarity for 40 years plus. You have unipolarity for 30 years plus whatever. And now we may be heading into something else. It may be a return to multipolarity. It may be a new bipolarity with China. But whatever it is, it's something different than it has been. And the reason it's important to talk about this is because a lot of the individual policy choices that have been made by American decision makers, which seem deeply contingent, which seem deeply personal, which seemed almost random. Oh, if you have this guy in there or that situation, it could go totally differently. In fact, there have been pressures and incentives from the system guiding you towards different things. You couldn't put the policies in the bipolar era in place back in the 19th century. And when you had the post Cold War era, you had a world that was geared around American power that continued a system that was essentially playing as a team. Now there is both international and domestic resistance for the continuation of the order that has been in place essentially in one form or another since 45. But we don't know what is going to replace it. And so the Trump phenomenon, whether you want to date it from 2016, whether you want to date it from 2024 or 2025, or somewhere in between, whatever, there's some new kind of situation starting in which the United States seems not to be playing by the rules that it has played for the last two sets of those cycles. It played by a set of rules during the bipolar era, and it played by a set of rules during the unipolar era. But in both of those eras, in the entire post-war stretch, all of today's times, it has seen itself as the guardian of the system in general, and it has seen itself doing that as leading a team of others in which it wanted the world to be stable and essentially avoid great power war, have a relatively open trading system, and move somewhat gradually towards a common view of democracy and markets and freedom across different spheres. Steve Walt said, oh, Korea was different because we didn't try to impose regime change. We didn't try to make it a democracy. And that's absolutely true. On the other hand, it became one anyway. So we took that. Korea, I would argue, is the poster child for the American era because it ends up becoming a sort of liberal capitalist democracy, even without constant pushing, just because it's included in our sphere. But that entire sphere is now disintegrating, and we have lost faith in it, and others have lost faith in it. And that is the context in which Trump comes to power and starts to try things that are different. And so to talk about what Trump is trying to do differently and whether that will succeed and what will come in the future, we have three extraordinary panelists. You know their backgrounds, they're in your papers there. I'm not going to waste time reading them, but we have Bob Kagan, we have Rebecca Lissner, we have Leslie Vinjamuri. These are experts who are going to tell us how this era we're entering in now is different from all other previous eras. Manishtana halayla hazeh. Why is this era different from all other eras? And it's not because we get to recline at the council. Bob, why is this era different? We can't hear you. Unmute yourself. First time that's ever been said to a Kagan.
I was muted by the organization, so
now
that really wasn't me. Okay. Thank you, Gideon. First of all, thank you, by the way. Thank you, CFR, for having me here. It's wonderful to, I'm sorry, not really literally here, but be on this wonderful panel. I was just saying, I don't believe, it's not clear to me that we are entering something that's completely different. It seems to me that we are entering something that looks a lot like what existed before 1945, and, you know, when we really had a genuinely multipolar world, and when it was pretty much everybody for himself. Interestingly, the United States in the 20s and 30s was the most powerful country in the world. It was certainly the richest country in the world. So it isn't so much a question of whether the U.S. is powerful or not. It has to do with what the U.S. wants to do with that power. And so, and the characteristics of this world, I think people need to understand clearly, because sometimes international relations theorists talk about balance of power and the stability of a multipolar world, but the truth is the multipolar world has historically highly unstable and very aggressive. Even in what some people describe as the long peace of the 19th century, the great powers were almost constantly at war with one another. So imagine a world in which the United States and Russia and China, but also Japan, which is a former great power and likely a future great power, and perhaps Germany, and who knows how else, who else. Imagine a world in which we are pretty much once a decade engaged in a war with one or more of those great powers. That is what a multipolar world has always looked like. That is what we're returning to, only, of course, with much greater destructiveness. And as far as the Trump administration is concerned, getting to this world is a conscious policy. It's not an error. It's not a failure to understand. It is a conscious policy. The administration and many Americans of both parties concluded that maintaining this world order that you described so well, Gideon, is, too expensive, too much of a burden, not really in our interests. And I think people have forgotten what the actual alternative is, but it's been very much a conscious decision. This is, people have said, great power is a choice, and we have chosen not to now play this role. And we're already reaping the consequences of it. And I'm sure we're going to talk about the effect of the Iran war on all of this, but one clear effect has been the further driving of wedges between the United States and its traditional allies, and I would say a strengthening of the two sort of have-not expansionist great powers, Russia and China. So I think that actually the United States is suffering a strategic setback overall as a result of the Iran war, but it's only a continuation of the course that the Trump administration had already set us on.
Okay, I'm going to stick with Bob for 200 for a second because I want to follow up very quickly. One thing that's been different is the advent of nuclear weapons. So there are some who would argue that you can't go back to a pre-45 multipolar era in exactly the same way because there are now nuclear weapons in the world, and so that's going to either provide deterrence or raise war. The second thing is, to the extent that you're right about the badness of the multipolar world, which I agree with, which is why we created all this different world, as that reality that you just described becomes more obvious to people, will that create a homeostatic pressure to pull the United States back into a more hegemonic, team-building, benign role in order to head off what you're talking about?
Well, that's the latter one is a very interesting question, and I think, but it seems to me the answer is no, and nor am I sure that we can ever go back. I don't, so much of the order that we have been living in since 1945 was based on trust that the United States could be trusted with this enormous power and not abuse it, especially in its relations with its own allies, and trust that the United States would, in fact, make good on its security commitments. Both elements of those trusts are now gone. The United States is using its great power to bully, including its closest allies, and it has also withdrawn effectively the security guarantee that everyone has depended on. So I don't see how, especially if we're going to have 3 years of this, a lot can happen in 3 years. A lot has already happened in 1 year. So I don't really think if I were one of America's allies, I would not trust the United States again the way I have trusted it before. And now I've already forgotten your first objection.
Nuclear weapons, but we'll get back to that. Okay.
No, actually, I want to say something about nuclear weapons quickly, which is that I think we should not assume that great powers can't go to war in a sub-nuclear fashion. The United States and China are planning for that kind of war every single day. I conceive it possible that the United States could be in a war with Russia that would not go nuclear. Before World War II, they said the bomber will always get in, and air power has made war unfeasible. And that has often been said about many modern weapons, and it's often turned out not to be true.
That'll be a fascinating experiment to run. We'll see this, actually. Rebecca is leading a giant project at the council, all-council effort on the future of American strategy. So, Rebecca, how much of the strategy we have put in place over the last 75 years, 80 years, is salvageable, and what needs to change?
Well, thanks, Gideon, and it's great to be here with Leslie and Bob and with you for this symposium, which has been a really interesting discussion over the course of the day. So let's just start off with this idea of the liberal international order, which I think is easy to rhapsodize about, but it's also easy to critique, right? The liberal international order was never completely liberal. It was never totally international, and it was never completely orderly, right? And so it's easy to caricature that concept and what it delivered for the United States. And yet this was a system that was constructed out of the embers of World War II, that was largely in service of American power, American preferences, that we constructed in large part with our allies and partners, but really did put American interests at its center. And what I think is so novel about the experiment that we're seeing the present administration run is the decision to dismantle that system, as Bob said, as a matter of policy. So Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio, when he was testifying before Congress to be confirmed in his role as Secretary of State, said the liberal international order isn't just obsolete, it's a weapon being used against us, right? And so the Trump administration has set out to dismantle that order, and in doing so has done something that's really historically unprecedented. Gideon referenced, usually orders fall through great power war. Occasionally they fall because empires collapse under their own weight. I would posit that never before in history has a reigning hegemon taken the choice to dismantle a system that it built to serve its own power and preferences and was flawed but still delivering results. And so this is something that, in my personal writing, I've called a stunning act of superpower suicide, right? The United States has basically decided to dismantle this own system that it has built and that was sustaining its own power, albeit with important flaws and albeit with a real need to be renovated. So what does that mean we're entering into? I think that it means that we're entering into a new world disorder rather than a new world order. We're seeing these acts of tremendous destruction, but without a real sense of what comes next and what we're building towards. That could still come in the future, but I haven't seen that coming out of US policy in recent years. And so there are a few features of this new world disorder. One is violent conflict. There were quite a few, I forget exactly the number, something on the order of 7 interstate conflicts last year. I think the United States has now bombed 7 or 8 countries under this Trump administration. The norm of non-aggression has been patently eroded in consequential ways. And so we are just entering into, and frankly have already entered, a much more violent period of history than the one that we had been living through in recent times. And the United States is very much a participant in that, right? We don't see our use of military force as being constrained, and if anything, have sort of taken the choice to unshackle it, including most dramatically and recently in this new war with Iran. Another feature is economic nationalism. I think we see that every country is really out for itself, and the idea that we were living in a system that had universal rules, for example, to govern trade under the WTO. Well, the United States is no longer participating in that system, and it's encouraging other countries to defect from it too. And there are some very good reasons for that. I think the admission of China into the WTO, frankly, broke that system and made it very difficult to sustain. But that's the world that we're living in now, where great powers are sort of making up their own economic rules or competing with one another for resources such as critical minerals and so on. And so then this sort of begs the question, who's going to fill the gap? If the United States is no longer an order builder, will it be China? But it's not clear that China wants to provide that kind of system-level leadership, that kind of public goods provision that the United States has done since World War II. So I don't think that China can fully step into that void, nor have they shown evidence that they want to. And we heard the Carney speech at Davos from the Prime Minister of Canada. There's been this impulse amongst middle powers to come together, but it's not clear that they really have the cohesion or, frankly, the power to sustain either the old order or to build a new one. And so cumulatively, I think we're just entering a phase where for the foreseeable future, the international system is going to be substantially more disorderly, unpredictable, chaotic, and that's just the world that everyone's going to have to adapt to.
Excellent. Leslie, what did Bob or Rebecca get wrong or leave out?
Well, Rebecca got it all right. And
Sorry, Bob.
I should start by saying, Rita, thank you. It's tremendous to be able to participate in this, and I know you're the person who's made it possible together with everybody here at CFR. And I'm a member, and I love this place. It's great to be in New York as well. So I guess a couple of comments. Maybe, and sorry if I've misinterpreted some of your opening remarks, but I would push back against this idea that this is all structural. I know you weren't quite saying that, but it's a good, thing to knock back against. I'm one of those people who think that President Trump is very much an agent, not simply a symptom, and that, of course, there are structural changes, and Charlie on the previous panel talked about some of those economic changes within the United States polity that sort of have given rise to a populist pushback. But I think President Trump is very much an agent. He's very much a leader, and he has transformed many things within the United States and globally. And within the United States, I think you can look at the the data on polarization, Pew looked at this going back to 2017, and there's no doubt about it. He's really cemented and magnified and accelerated polarization of the United States. He's also jumped on a trend, the executive authority of the president, and he's sort of driven that forward in phenomenal ways, partly through violating norms, but also through tactics of intimidation. I think it's important to note that fear and intimidation that's pervasive across much of our ruling classes right now. So I'd sort of, Trump as agency, I think, is a really important part of the story. Another thing on the can we go back? Are we in a moment where we're necessarily, for structural reasons and for structural reasons being the rise of China, other middle powers that have a significant part of the global economy and some autonomy, that we're necessarily structurally moving into, if not multipolarity, an era where multi-alignment is certainly going to be the norm. The other part of can we go back is that trust is broken, therefore we cannot go back. This is something I think it's extremely important. And my view on this is that we have seen a number of very important countries do very destructive and damaging things in the last, if you go back 80 years, right? I'm thinking the Second World War. And the thing that makes it possible to rebuild trust has everything to do with the transition. Right now, our transition is likely to be something that takes place at the ballot box. If the next U.S. president, regardless of whether he or she is Republican or Democrat, wins on a knife edge against a candidate that is aligned with those things that have led others to distrust us, then I think it's going to be very difficult to rebuild trust, because the world will look at us and they'll say, okay, we get 4 years of this and 4 years of that, and you have a polarized society, and forget it. If, however, we have a transition, whether it's at the electoral box or whether it's a broader transition, that begins a national conversation in our civic organizations across our country, at the highest levels, at the lowest levels, grassroots, it says to the rest of the world, we've done certain things to you that are not fair. We recognize it and we want to rebuild. I think there's everything to play for. So I think we should really be careful not to be deterministic about the future of our relationship with our allies. The other thing I would say when it comes to can we go back is that Europeans, as we know, I mean, look at the papers today, look at the news for the last, 14 months, are struggling. My view, I just spent 20 years living in the UK. My view is that many Europeans would give nothing, they would give every limb possible to never have to depend on the United States ever again. But guess what? The world is about alternatives, especially the world of great power politics, and the world of a rising China and assertive Russia, and a very destructive, potentially productive, but potentially destructive technology that the United States and China have the upper hand on, and that's obviously AI. But there's also quantum, the robotics, there are lots of things coming their way. So you don't just walk away from a bully who happens to be a little bit more aligned with, or frankly, a lot more aligned with you because it's a bad patch. So the search for alternatives is real, but those alternatives are radically inferior, just materially speaking, to what is on offer still from the United States. And I'd like to believe, but trust me, the headlines are very upsetting. When Philip Stevens published his Substack yesterday, and I've forgotten exactly what he was arguing, but I immediately took umbrage because he said, the Americans, they're not really our friends. And I wanted to say, but please differentiate between the American people and the American leadership. And this has been an issue for Europeans for a long time, right? In the middle, after the first Trump administration, the line on the street was, we'll give you a pass once. If you do it again, we're going to take you seriously. 27, the numbers they're different polls, but I think about 27% of Americans support the strikes right now on Iran. So there's a difference still between the leadership and the people, right? So I hope that also becomes part of the equation, and can we go back? There are layers to our society It's incredibly important, more now than ever before in the history of our country, I believe, that those layers are embedded transnationally and that we don't let the story of America be captured simply by one of our admittedly very important institutions.
Okay, let me push back on Leslie for 200. You said the Europeans would do anything to not be dependent on the United States, anything that is, except work a little longer, lower their pensions and Social Security, buy an actual strategic autonomous capability, and so forth. So the things that Europe could basically get its economy, get its military in great shape relatively quickly, unify, create a common energy and services market, create financial markets, buy weaponry, do all sorts of things. They don't want to do that because it would be expensive and it would be difficult and it would be scary. We may push them into doing that, but the question that I'm asking you is, yeah, there's been a lot of loss of trust. And yeah, we're pushing the boundaries of the relationship. We've cheated on our relationship partners. But there's still these things, peace and prosperity, the kids that we want to sort of stay together. And the apartment we're both living in is so expensive that we can't move out. Neither one of us can afford a new apartment. Our entire defense industries are integrated. If Europe were to be strategically autonomous, if we were to be strategically autonomous in Europe, we would have to fundamentally restructure the purchase and deployment and strategic operational rationales for all of our defense industry. Is that actually going to happen? Is the trust deficit that you're talking about so great that we're really going to have a strategic divorce across the Atlantic?
Yeah, so I actually think we agree because, the second part of the point was, first of all, the trust deficit. We have a huge amount to play for. We can rebuild the trust and we can actually have a much stronger partnership where actually when the US president says to its key European allies, we have a problem in the Strait of Hormuz, could you help us out? They at least quietly say, we'd like to. We didn't really want to be there, by the way, but here we are. And they quietly try to develop plans for what can be done at a moment of profound crisis for all of us, right? But the point I was trying to make was that the other reason, the negative reason why this relationship is likely to hang together is because there are not great alternatives. I think to be fair to the debate that's taking and the investment that's taking place across many of America's NATO allies, there is increased spending on defense, as you know. This is a live and active, not only conversation, but investment. And they are running up, as you also know, profound domestic divisions, slowed growth. And the story, I think, is probably quite well known amongst this audience. There are huge barriers, but I think that the intention is running in the right direction. We haven't really been on the right side of this always. When Bridge Colby traveled to the Munich Security Conference this year, he made it very clear. He doesn't want, and I think he made it actually very clear on this stage too, he doesn't want Europeans to have independent nuclear capabilities, that NATO is going to, that the United States is pushing a reform agenda with respect to the multilateral organizations, not a get out of town agenda. Yes, the United States got out of 66 multilaterals, but not the UN, not the WTO, not the IMF, not the World Bank, going down the list, right? So, all in all, I think the Europeans are trying. There are a lot of structural difficulties. There are a lot of domestic political difficulties. But we're likely to be in this together because there are no great alternatives. So we might as well try to make it as good as it can be.
It's interesting. You know how far we've come when Bridge Colby is the leading liberal internationalist in the administration. And you know how far we've come when you have to go to the sub-cabinet level to get a serious discussion about foreign policy and strategy. So question to you guys. As you mentioned Trump today, we need to work with our allies. Why aren't other people helping us? If the Trump strategy of purely go it alone clearly can't work to the realities of the 21st century that we're in now, and if there really doesn't seem to be domestic American support, put aside foreign support, but certainly domestic American support for keeping things going as they were, all three of you, last question before we turn it over to our panelists here, to our participants here, is there something that is a sort of liberal international order light, a unipolarity light, an American team that has less dominance by Michael Jordan and more distributed passing and shooting from other members of the team. Is that a possibility, and is that what the next post-Trump administration should shoot for? Bob, to you.
Look, we could talk all we want about what may or may not happen, et cetera, but I think that that's a distraction, honestly, from what is actually happening. And just to look at the effect of the Iran war already, I mean, for Europe, this isn't about, with all due respect, this isn't about them working harder or what. Europe faces an existential threat now in the form of Russia. That is what they feel. Russia has committed aggression against a European state. Here in the United States, we used to believe that Russia's goals did not end in Ukraine, but only begin in Ukraine. But certainly that is the European view. So here we are in a situation which I think, since World War II, America has been sort of primarily concerned with precisely the crisis that Europe is facing right now, okay? The war on Iran has been a strategic disaster in this existential crisis for Europe. It is providing tens of billions of dollars, and for how long the price of oil remains above 100, who knows, to Putin at a time when Putin was suffering from terrible budget deficits. This has bought him time in the war. This has extended his ability to continue fighting. And at the same time, the war has depleted the stocks of vital weaponry, particularly Patriot interceptors and other interceptors that Ukraine depends on to defend its population centers in this conflict. So this has already been a major strategic setback for Europe. And it is not surprising to me that Europeans are not rushing to send their ships into the Gulf to deal with a crisis that the United States has absolutely created all by itself, and detract from the fact that what they need to be doing is defending themselves against Russia. And so what we're looking at is the prospect of, and by the way, China is also benefiting from the Iran war and particularly in strategic respects, and it's harming Japan and Korea, who were highly dependent on the oil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we can talk about the day when we start to pull out of this, but right now we are not pulling out, we are still heading down. And I think it's going to continue to get much worse. And that's the reality that we need to be talking about right now, in my view, anyway.
Agreed, although I hope we can get beyond Orange Man Bad for a little bit, because there are things that will happen sort of down the road. And Rebecca, so is there a possibility, even theoretically, between something that is a third alternative from the thesis of liberal international order to the antithesis of, America first? Is there some synthesis that is a more moderate restraint version of the order that could potentially, in a post-Trump world, gain both domestic and international support and be a strategic option for the U.S.?
Absolutely, yes. I think if you look at the public opinion polling that Leslie's organization does, that others do, you go out and talk to Americans, which is something I've been spending quite a bit of time doing in places like Detroit and Phoenix and Atlanta, the picture that emerges quite clearly is that the American people want global engagement. There's actually not a lot of support for this idea of what we used to think of as America first, kind of isolationism or global retrenchment. MAGA voters want to see the United States globally engaged for the most part, traditional Republicans, Democrats, independents. So there's actually very broad support for that. And even if you look at the polling on alliances specifically, their most recent poll from the Chicago Council shows that 91% of Americans, which I think is a historic high, think that alliances are a useful tool of statecraft, and in many cases useful than many other tools. But all of that needs to be juxtaposed against the finding that Gallup, for example, has, that almost every single year since 2006, the majority of Americans have reported dissatisfaction with the United States' role in the world. And so you have this kind of continued support for certain key pillars of American internationalism, for the idea of international engagement, because I do believe that there's very little constituency for weakness when it comes to America's role in the world. And I also believe that the American people want the United States to be a maker and not a taker of international rules and international events. But that does not mean that any president has a blank check when it comes to the use of force, when it comes to aggression overseas, when it comes to expenditures of American blood and treasure, and really when it comes to entanglements, because that's the other consistent finding that you see across time, and certainly in the post-Cold War era, is that the American people really don't like getting bogged down in prolonged, costly overseas wars. So to me, when you take that all together, it means, yes, there's absolutely a future path for the United States where we are both globally engaged and disciplined. And the only viable version of that strategy is one that where we're working together with our allies and partners. Because when you combine the United States with our allies and partners, whether it's our share of global GDP, whether it's our share of global military power, whether it's our share of global economic power, our regulatory power, it's just massive, and it dwarfs the China threat. When you just take the United States alone, then the competitive landscape becomes a lot more difficult. So I think the post-Trump task is going to be, how do you create new alliance bargains? And they're not all going to look the same. I think Leslie's right. In Europe, frankly, the lack of a viable alternative path for Europe on the one hand is going to foster continued dependency on the United States, at least in some areas. But on the other hand, they are doing more. And so the United States is still going to be by far the most powerful country in NATO. It will be hard for NATO to sustain itself as a credible collective security organization that deters Russia without the United States in the near term, at minimum without our nuclear deterrent. But they're doing more on their own, and that's going to create new forms of friction. And so I think that's where we get back to this trust question. What is it going to look like for the United States to remain immensely powerful as an actor in the European security architecture, but with some diminished influence and with greater friction in trying to get our allies to do the things that we want them to do, for example, helping us to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. In the Indo-Pacific, it's a different situation, because there, I think, our allies have even fewer exit options, right? The idea of Japan trying to kind of hedge with China is pretty hard to conjure at this point, but they don't have the same collective security architecture that our European allies do. They don't have any nuclear powers within the region, the way that UK and France, as we've seen with the renewed extended deterrence debate in NATO, can provide that function. And so in the Indo-Pacific, I think there's an even more stark lack of alternative, which means that they want to continue to be our allies, and we need to figure out on what terms. That gets me to this final point, which is, what are the terms that we want? And I do think this is a place where President Trump has created more space. We now have allies that are willing to do more. And so I think the question for the future is, how do you build on that in a spirit of rebuilding trust, but also in encouraging our allies to continue to foster greater capabilities? And part of that is going to have to be recentering these alliance structures so that they're not centrally predicated on what the United States can do for our allies, how we can extend American security guarantees to our allies, but how do we nest that within an alliance structure that shifts some burdens to allies, that also puts technology and technological cooperation more towards the center, that centers more economic cooperation, including on supply chains and other things that matter to Americans, all of which is good for the United States strategically, is good for our allies strategically. We'll put these on a sounder strategic foundation for the future, but also can help us make the case to the American public why these alliances aren't just a handout or some form of charity that the United States is doing for these sort of luxuriating Europeans who are on their endless August vacations, but rather something that's actually grounded in a strategic theory of the case that delivers immediate benefits to the American people. So all to say, there's absolutely a third way, and I think the task is just to begin to craft what those terms are and be very clear about how they benefit Americans.
President Trump has created a space for new discussion. It sounds like you think that the president, like alliances, is a useful tool. Leslie, same question to you. Is there a possibility for reestablishing trust in some collective way among the United States and its allies that would be acceptable to them, acceptable or appropriate to the problems, and domestically palatable here?
I think it depends. I mean, I very much agree with the kind of longer-term vision that you gave, but I think, there's no way around it. We've got to go through it. And so Bob's comment, we are in a phenomenal, and not in a good way, moment of of radical destruction. And so I do think that this war isn't just sort of a blip that we're going to get through. It's going to make the entire geopolitics, obviously, of the region, but of many of our key relationships with partners and allies, probably much more fraught. It's going to make it harder to think of Trump as, I was sort of more in line with the argument that President Trump, for better and for worse, was giving us a moment of opportunity to restructure and rethink the balance of power within our alliance structure. And I think we're kind of at a moment of decision and choice, and it does matter how we get through this, what the answer to that question is. So yeah, I'm very much in there is no determinism. If I were on the outside of American power, and I think I am actually, I think many of us are, to be very honest. If I were not a US citizen on the outside of American power, I would certainly be looking to diversify my options. We know that folks are doing this. India seems to, be playing this quite well. The strategy of multi-alignment. When I was at the Raisina dialogue in India about 10 days ago, they hosted U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Chris Landa, who told them off. And then they hosted the Israeli foreign minister. This is a couple of days after the strikes were launched. They hosted the Israeli foreign minister on Zoom. Then the next morning, they hosted the Iranian deputy foreign minister in person. And guess what? They just got 2 ships through the Strait of Hormuz. But here's the thing. For a long time, I was thinking, gosh, it's playing all sides, multi-alignment. And I had a kind of aha moment when, a couple of different Indians, the foreign secretary and the foreign minister, at different points in the dialogue said, our number one adversary is poverty. It's not China, it's not America, it's not Russia, it's poverty. And so multi-alignment is the strategy that we use to make sure that we can continue to access what we need to access so that we can get the growth that we need, which needs to be 6, 7, or 8%, because if it isn't, we will not conquer, we will not continue to lift people out of poverty in our country. I mean, it seems pretty smart, actually. So I think that, for the rest of the world, diversification, multiple partners, and the question for the United States is whether it can somehow get through this not just moment, this war, which is spinning certainly out of the president's control, and somehow either in these next 3 years or the president's successor or the people of America and our institutions can make a compelling case for why to, give America kind of more than just what it would get on the basis of the fact that we have a whole lot to offer materially.
I put a picture of the meeting with Modi and Putin and Xi that was on the front page of the Times in front of my IR class in the fall. And I said, the question here is couple, throuple, or situationship? These are interesting questions and why we are at a potential inflection point in the system. At this point, I want to go to our members and guests in New York and on Zoom to join the conversation with questions. A reminder, this reading is on the question, first on the record. First question, right over here. Wait for your microphone and please state your name and affiliation and a quick question.
Thank you. Toby Gotti. I worked in the Clinton administration on Russia and then in INR. I thought the title of this panel should have really been The Trump Era and the Demise of the U.S.-Led Order, because for those of us sitting here for the first panel and now for this, think about it. We had a foreign policy elite that worked together. Nobody said, what's in it for me? What deal can I do? People felt they had a stake in the system. They weren't running away from it and saying, I got to keep my job in Congress. So why don't we view things that way? There's no more deference, obviously, to Congress. The private interests, frankly, are what's directing where our foreign policy goes, and no one has mentioned that, although we kind of all represent in some way that private interest. So how does this influence foreign policy? And the question that's sort of the elephant in the room, how does it influence our domestic system? Because the difference between Vandenberg and others is profound. I mean, we heard this morning that Truman and others couldn't have done what he'd done if Congress hadn't approved it. And we're not even able to get Congress to vote anymore. So my question is really, how are these domestic and international factors connected? I think it shows that they are. For example, the Iran war is connected to the Epstein files. Are they really, is it really connected to anything else?
Maybe we can get into that. Okay, so question for the panel. Why are American elites so scummy? Like Pogo, have we met the problem and it is us?
And so we really could reach a crisis in weeks, not in years. And I know we like to think that, but our political system is really quite fragile.
Why have American elites declined so much from the Augustites represented in this room?
Well, I can start. I mean, not to frame this as a defense of the elites or any of the kind of behavior that you described, but I mean, I think the simple answer is partisan polarization, right? I mean, we can overstate the degree to which there was ever a Cold War consensus, the degree to which politics ever stopped at the water's edge. Of course, it didn't. But if you look from the 1970s, roughly the Vietnam era onwards, there have just been dramatic trends of Republicans and Democrats sorting into increasingly ideological consistent blocs, and that their foreign policy views are becoming increasingly aligned with their views on other political matters. That's being further exacerbated by the rise of affective polarization, where it's not just that you've self-sorted into groups, but you actually have negative feelings towards people who are in the other group. And so as a result, we have this just highly polarized political system where the number of voters up for grabs in the middle are pretty small. The upside of bipartisanship is pretty small. In order to succeed within certain, more partisan aligned elite structures, you need to show your bona fides. And it also makes it harder to break with your own party because there's not really another home. And I think that's part of how you get to a place where the Trump administration can be as kleptocratic as it is, because there's just not so much of a structure within which at least members of the Republican Party are willing to or able to criticize. And so to me, it's incredibly difficult because there are no good solutions for how you begin to reverse this long-term trend. We can talk about civic education, we can talk about civil discourse, all of that is important, but it really is a long-term structural trend, and one that doesn't just affect the standards to which our leaders are held and doesn't just affect our ability to pass bipartisan legislation, it also affects our ability to act as a credible global actor. Because when any country is negotiating whether an Iran nuclear deal or a trade deal with the United States of America, they're now thinking in at most a 4-year time horizon and often shorter, which means that it's just going to be harder for the United States to do diplomacy when there's an expectation that we have such highly volatile politics such that every time the White House changes hands, you're going to get a dramatically different set of policies that are potentially captive to an entirely different set of interests. So the effect on our foreign policy standing can't be understated either.
Leslie or Bob, any comments on scummy elites?
I'll go after Bob.
Look, I mean, at the largest level, we're suffering from a major elite failure, purely even before you get to foreign policy, on the domestic issues. It's one of the most striking things about this period, the cowering of almost every institution in New York, I would say, from the financial community to the legal community, and then, of course, needless to say, the political class in Washington. How to explain this elite collapse? I don't know. It probably goes deep into, what's happened to the American character or something like that. But I wouldn't even attribute it simply to polarization. A lot of it is what I think was mentioned earlier. There's a lot of fear involved, and that's because we have a president who would like to rule as a dictator and is trying to rule as a dictator. I mean, we have these nice foreign policy discussions, and I'm glad somebody brought up the domestic situation, because it's impossible to talk about foreign policy. American foreign policy is always driven by domestic political and ideological battles. And in this case, it's definitely being driven by the fact that we have a regime that is trying to dismantle the elements of democracy in this country. and who, in my view, are not even intending to allow a free and fair election this year. So, that's part of why I have a hard time with I can't wait till the Trump administration is out of power so we can fix everything, because I'm not at all persuaded that we're going to get to that point.
Quick comment on.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons is because actually at the headline, a lot of the truths are true, right? That the Maduro was a truly terrible, destructive, horrific leader that did horrible things to his people and to his economy. The Ayatollah who the US has assassinated was responsible for the murder of large numbers of people on the streets of Tehran and a brutal dictatorship over many years. Trade has been unfair to American workers. I mean, go down the list, right? The United States hasn't gotten a fair shake on many of the multilateral deals that it struck. And so then the question is, what's the remedy? And the debate is about the remedy. And in order to debate the remedy, first you have to have two things. One is you have to have people that understand highly complex situations well enough to have a view while they're doing their day jobs. And secondly, they have to have the channels of influence. And so we've sort of eroded our education, and we've also eroded our channels of influence. So I think and then we have people who are taking advantage across the whole of society at the elite level. And then finally, I don't think people are scummy. I think people are afraid, concerned, intimidated, and worried. And so I think that most people are good, not everybody, but I think the vast majority of people are good, have the right intentions, but they're not being, we're not set up to succeed right now. The question is, how do you get from here to there?
I used to think that. I'm not so sure now. Over here, we have a question from Zoom, from the cloud.
We'll take the next question from Catherine Hagan. Ms. Hagan, please accept the unmute now prompt.
Okay, in the meantime, we'll go to one over here. Yes. Hold on, wait a second. Wait for your mic.
I'd like to go back to
Identify
you,
yourself,
Rebecca. Henny Sender from BlackRock. I'd like to go back to your question about are changes reversible in one specific context, which is about innovation and the new world of autonomous weaponry and the deterrent effect when a drone can take out a battleship, and how you see the balance of power changing. And in a world where everything is dual-use technology, is all the research cuts in innovation also going to be reversible or not?
Very interesting question. Bob, you want to start with that one or no?
She asked Rebecca, and Rebecca's the right person to answer.
Rebecca, you go for it.
I may or may not be the right person to answer, but I'm happy to take a swing at it. So look, I think this is one of the tectonic shifts that we're seeing in terms of the strategic environment in which the United States operates, where you now have these very low-cost technologies that can inflict the kind of kinetic damage that was previously reserved to only the most advanced militaries. And there are sort of the happier versions of that story. Like if you look at, what Ukraine has been able to do, particularly in building up its indigenous defense industrial base and its production of drones, and increasingly drones without any PRC origin components, and the destruction that's inflicted on the Russian military. That's a very good news story, I think, from a perspective of US interests, at least as I conceive of them. And yet you're also seeing the proliferation of drones to actors whose interests are opposed to ours, whether that's Russia, whether that's Iran. I mean, Russia with Iranian drones, but you're also seeing drones being used in conflicts like the ongoing civil war that we see in Sudan. And so just the barrier to entry when it comes to these is a reality that we're going to have to contend with. Again, there's a potential upside story where the U.S. military, if it wanted to invest in this kind of like high density, attritable mass concept, there's a lot that we could do to learn from that, and it would be much less expensive than buying aircraft carriers and a lot of the high-end exquisite systems that we've grown accustomed to. There's still a lot of adaptation yet to come. I think, a lot of this is coming out of the private sector. And so in that sense, I think there's a short-term, long-term story when it comes to the R&D cuts. In the near term, I mean, I think any country in the world, potentially with the exception of China, would be over the moon if their R&D base looked anything like ours. Like what the United States is producing as a matter of innovation is truly stunning, and particularly when you look at generative AI. But it is also the case that that is the result of decades of public investment that is far, far, far upstream. But as we're doing much less of that, and especially investing much less as a federal government in basic research and basic science, I think over the long run, if you ask the people who study this much more closely than I do, they'll tell you that over the long run, that will impede our ability to remain the most innovative economy and country in the world. And so that will have ramifications for national security, but it will also just have ramifications for productivity and prosperity in the United States. And so that's one of the ways in which I worry that this administration, even as it is putting on these bristling and stunning displays of American power, could in parallel be taking measures that are eroding the wellsprings of our power, whether that's rule of law and democracy or whether that's our science and innovation base over the medium to long term.
Out of curiosity, I just asked Chat whether current developments in military technology are favoring offense and defense. And its response was, today the picture is mixed, but many analysts argue that several emerging technologies currently tilt the tactical and operational balance toward defense, even as some technologies simultaneously empower precision offensive strike. So actually, the world of advancing technology and what it is going to look like and what its strategic effects are, very interesting subject. On these and other kind of topics in general, there is no better place to look than foreign affairs to track, not because we know what the hell is happening, because we don't, but because whatever smart people think at the cutting edge of serious discussion on these issues will be featured in foreign affairs pretty quickly, because that's what its job is. So if you want to continue this discussion, because it's not really a matter of opinion, it's a matter of tracking and adapting to what's actually happening on the ground, continue to come to council events and read foreign affairs. Another question. Yes, over here.
Paul Sheard. Is there any role for the United Nations, and particularly the Security Council, in the future of a US-led order or whatever order may be coming for that matter?
I would say no, but I'm sure our panelists might have an answer to that. Any of you think the UN has any role to play?
Of course. I mean, of course. Of course it does. Because, I mean, you can't explain, and the Security Council, obviously, but the UNGA, people keep coming. They turn up in September. Why do they turn up? It doesn't make any sense, right? In terms of, actual impact. And yet it matters. People turn up. They think it matters. They want to have the conversation. They believe that the discussions, that the deliberation is significant. They believe that the side conversations are meaningful. They believe that it takes people to move things top to bottom. Does the UN Security Council need to be reformed? Clearly, obviously. Will it be? Obviously not. But, I think we'll keep it and we'll build other, it's happening now, right? Plurilateral, multilateral, supportive peace. Lots of other things are going to spring up. But yes, of course, it matters.
Leslie or Bob, do you think the UN matters?
I'm Leslie.
Sorry, Rebecca or Bob, do you think the UN matters?
Yeah. Bob, go ahead.
It matters. The UN Security Council is only as good as the relationships among the permanent member great powers, and when there have been moments when it's been possible for them to cooperate. The Soviet Union voted in favor of the first Gulf War, but I think those times are few and far between. And basically, if we're in a multilateral competition, that competition is not going to be settled or managed at the level of the UN Security Council.
Another question. Yes, back here.
Thank you. I'm Aaron Romani. I'm a finance professional here in New York, so I'll ask an economics-related question. A key tenet of the pre-Trump world order was the US dollar being the reserve currency of the world. And of course, the kind of trade-off there was if everyone's buying dollars, then US exports are less competitive, which means industries here erode. President Trump has seemed to kind of turn that on its head. And in the interest of bringing industries back, it's kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying, the reserve currency of the world being the US dollar no longer really matters. Why is this not as much a part of these strategic conversations as, in my opinion, it should be? And is it really even subject to that kind of strategic consideration?
Great question. Will the dollar actually risk losing its status as a reserve currency. We've heard about this threat again and again, decade after decade, but it hasn't yet happened. Will it happen, or is it happening now? Any of you want to tackle that?
Bob.
Because economics is your forte.
What did I do to deserve this? No, I mean, look, it isn't, in fact. The only thing because I don't even know what it takes because I'm not an economist, I don't know what exactly it takes for the dollar to stop being the currency. There have to be alternatives. But if the dollar's preeminence follows the fact and existence of a fundamentally unipolar world in which the United States is sort of managing this global security structure that everybody trusts, I would say if that is a prerequisite to the dollar being the reserve currency, then we are losing that. I mean, everybody is going to be looking for ways to undepend themselves on the United States because the United States has proved itself not only unreliable, but dangerous to them. So if they have an option of eliminating the dollar as a reserve currency, they will do so. I just don't happen to know technically what it takes to be able to do that.
I guess I would just pick up on Bob's point about alternatives, right? We've been fearing the loss of dollar dominance for a long time. There was a view that the U.S. was, abusing its exorbitant privilege in such a way that was leading others to seek alternatives. Certainly, there have been attempts to create alternatives, but none of them have really coalesced, right? So much about dollar dominance has to do with network effects, which no other country or currency has been able to create in the same way. That said, we are seeing the advent of alternative payment mechanisms that are creating more opportunities for countries to do transactions in ways that don't touch the US dollar, don't touch the US financial system. There are strategic costs to that for the United States when it comes to financial intelligence, when it comes to our ability to track the financial flows, when it comes to our ability to exercise power via sanctions. So I think that could matter quite a bit. And certainly something that the Russians and the Chinese and others have been looking at very closely in terms of creating at least a structure that enables them to have an alternative set of pipes, so to speak, should they need it, even though they still very much, China in particular, transact and hold dollars. I think the other thing to watch here, and the finance professionals in the room will be much more sophisticated on this than I am, but is dollar-pegged stablecoin. And I think that is a way in which US dollar dominance could actually be further entrenched at the same time as the US government's ability to exert power over those flows is actually diminished. And so I think you could see the dollar continuing to be a very important feature of the global financial system, even as it becomes much more difficult for the United States to shape how financial institutions that are using those kinds of stable coins comply with sanctions regulations. And it will require a new kind of architecture of coercion that doesn't exist right now, or at least hasn't been adapted into that format. And the way that we exercise sanctions in particular has become a very well-oiled machine where, OFAC even just kind of indicating that it's taking a look at something can be enough for financial institutions to choose to de-risk and basically do our work for us.
I see Mike coming into the room, which means that our time is coming up. I don't want to talk about future council financial plans, but there has been talk about a CFR meme coin as the thing that will save the council's finances, but we'll talk about that. Lightning round, last quick question. We're clearly in a tunnel, it's clearly dark, and the future is not particularly great. Is there light at the end, or is it darkness all the way down?
Error election. Let's have a vote.
Vote. The question of what to vote on. There's too many things to vote. Okay. Well, actually, you know what? This is a great question for discussion at the cocktail hour, which will start now, because even though it's 4:15, it's 5 o'clock somewhere. And I want to thank our panelists, Leslie and Rebecca and Bob. Thank all of you for attending a whole day ongoing.